Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Revelation study I've been calling Beastie Boys and Babylon Noise. I'm J.R. Foresteros. This is being broadcast through my Substack, so thank you to all of you who are already subscribing and supporting. We have finished up the first part of the book of Revelation, what I kind of consider the first vision sequence. We began in chapters 1 through 3, where we meet John, an elder of the church who is living in exile on an island called Patmos. We don't know exactly why. It just says, because of the word of the Lord, and so again, probably something to do with Jesus. And then we see that he is writing this letter to these 7 churches that live in, or that are in what we today call Turkey, but it was the Roman province of Asia. And these churches are all facing various forms of persecution from the larger Roman culture. And we've been looking at the fact that they're struggling to remain faithful to Jesus in the face of what we recognize today as authoritarian rule. And so we've been asking, how is John encouraging them to live faithfully? And what does that faithful life look like? Because then we can ask that about ourselves today for the increasingly authoritarian political powers that we are living under in our country. So the first vision that John experiences is Jesus appearing to him in this crazy cosmic incarnation of himself, and then dictating these messages to these 7 churches. And so that's what we went through, right? Chapter 4, which remember is a more recent innovation. John did not write in chapters, right? But he says, and then immediately after this, he's called up into heaven, and he experiences this insane vision. Like, I say insane, right? It was just this overwhelming, amazing vision with all these people bowing down, and these 4 creatures, and then there's this throne in the middle with someone seated on it, and there's storms and a rainbow, and just all this overwhelming imagery. And the thing that's so interesting about this scene is there's really not a lot of forward action happening. This is sort of John stepping into heaven in media res and just sort of seeing what's going on in heaven all the time. And so I want to break down a couple of things about the vision. First of all, I think it's important for us to note that in the book of Revelation, that we're going to see a lot of action that moves between heaven and earth, and they're mapped above and below, the sort of the same way we think about heaven up there, even though we know that it's just like outer space or whatever, right? But there's heaven above and there's earth below. And for all of the ancient peoples, this is sort of how they thought about where the gods lived and all of that. And what's really important to remember is that for the ancient Hebrews, and again, not just the ancient Hebrews, but definitely for the ancient Hebrews, whatever was happening in heaven directly impacted what was happening on earth. And you're going to see that as we begin to work through, not next week, but the week after, when Jesus starts to do stuff in heaven, and it has immediate visible consequences on earth. And so that's important to note, because if you remember, when we introduced Revelation, I told you to kind of think about the Wizard of Oz and how Dorothy and her friends were seeing this fearsome expression of Oz the Great and Powerful, but then Toto comes and pulls the curtain back, and there's just like the little old man working the levers behind the curtain. Well, by being taken into heaven, John is being invited behind the curtain to see what's really going on. He's being invited to see why the churches are experiencing persecution, and what the real stakes are. And John believes that if the larger church could understand what's happening in the heavenly dimension, it would help us to live more faithfully in the present. And so there's a couple things that I want to point out in this vision. I want to talk about the elders around the throne, and I want to talk about the creatures. So the elders, there's 24 of them. Numbers are super important in the book of Revelation. So 24. There's the obvious 2 times 12 there, and so there's a lot of ancient interpreters said, this is like the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, which is a perfectly fine interpretation. Again, when Jesus appointed 12 disciples to follow him, that was a very self-conscious reference to the nation of Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel. So seeing that is good. It's also important to notice, you'll see this a lot as we move through Revelation, when you multiply numbers by themselves, or by other numbers, that tends to magnify them. So this sort of doubling of 12 is a very important way to say, yeah, this is like the people of God, like emphasized or magnified. And what we see them doing is removing crowns from their head and laying them at the feet of the one who's seated on the throne. Now, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, we encountered one kind of crown, the wreath or the laurel crown that was promised to the church. I think there was the church in Smyrna, and God said, if you persist, you'll receive the crown, right? And we said that that was a particular Greek word that references the sort of laurel wreath crown that you would receive for winning the Olympics or something, right? And I said there was another kind of crown, the diadem, that is like the crown a king or a queen would wear. This is that. This is the diadem crown. And in fact, in some of the older translations, they will actually translate it as a diadem instead to preserve the separation of the Greek word. So, unfortunately, a lot of our more modern English translations just use crown for both. So it's hard to distinguish. But here specifically, we are not seeing them take their symbols of victory and lay them at the feet of the one seated on the throne. We're seeing them take their own symbols of power and authority and lay them at the feet of God, again, the one who is seated on the throne, right? It's also, we don't have a ton of time to go into this week, but we were circling back to as we move forward. You have to remember that the ancient world was largely non-literate. And so even the seven churches would have been hearing this read in worship, not so much like taking it home to read themselves. And they were surrounded as they went out by visual propaganda for the Roman Empire. And so this here is also visual propaganda for God. God is represented as this, one of my New Testament professors, Dr. Rodney Reeves, a lot of you probably know him or have interacted with him. He said that the Romans would have been like sort of scandalized by the appearance of God here, because God is showing up like a gaudy king from the east who's like all draped in silver and gold and has this big throne and all the, it's very gaudy, whereas the Romans preferred this like austere, very simple, almost like we would think of it today as like designed by Apple sort of like thing. And so they didn't flaunt their power, right? Whereas like the kings from the east would. So even God appearing this way and having this experience of the throne is meant to be a direct jab against Rome. John is also drawing here from very famous passages depicting God's throne in previous prophetic books like Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel. So again, this is not John just like coming up with stuff off the top of his head. He's drawing on the long Hebrew prophetic tradition. Now, the last thing we need to talk about before we finish this section is those creatures. There's four creatures, right? One, they're all flying. They have six wings, and one of them, they look like a man and a lion and an ox and an eagle. Again, there's a lot of ideas about this. A lot of the ancient interpreters said these are the four gospels. And so, you'll actually see this pretty common in Christian iconography. You'll see all four of them. And you'll see Matthew, I think, is the lion because Jesus is kingly, and Mark is the man because Jesus is the most human, and Luke is the ox because he's about like social justice and the poor, and then John is the eagle because his is the most spiritual. Sure, whatever, right? It's fun to match 4 and 4. Actually, though, these things represent cherubim, and cherubim are cherub, plural Hebrew cherubim, or I guess we could say cherubs, right? We usually see them as little precious moments angels, but actually in the Hebrew culture and in the larger surrounding ancient Mediterranean cultures, cherubim were these huge hybrid creatures. There's this amazing book, amazing with a capital amazing, by Esther Hamori, called God's Monsters, where she goes through the various monstrous creatures in the Bible. Again, I cannot overemphasize how cool this book is, but she talks about cherubim pretty early on. And I'm going to read a couple of pieces from her book here. She says, the original cherubim of a wider phenomenon, a type of hybrid guardian monster found all over ancient Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean. Composite creatures appear often in both mythology and iconography as guardians for the gods. There's logic to this. The fiercest creatures should serve as guardians for the gods, and what could be fiercer than a monster composed from the most powerful parts of other creatures? So cherubim were actually built in Solomon's temple to be like looking out of the temple. They're also on top of the Ark of the Covenant facing each other. And they're border creatures. That's also why they're hybrid, right? They're not one thing or the other. They're both. And then that way they protect the border or the crossing between the human and the divine realm. And Hamori points out that it goes both ways. It's not really mainly only to keep humans out of the godly realm. It's actually also to protect humanity from the power of God. And again, we have lots of stories in the Hebrew Bible where people interact with God in ways that are unsafe, and then they end up getting killed for it, like the guy who catches the Ark of the Covenant to keep it from falling, but he touches it and it strikes him dead. I like to think of it like radiation, right? God is so holy and powerful that when those who are unholy touch him, they're burned or they're consumed. It's too dangerous. And so the cherubim here act as these sort of divine protectors. They protect humanity from God, and they also protect, or they keep humans out of the divine realm who are not worthy of going there. And so we see them in front of the throne, and they're flying around, and they're saying, singing all this stuff, this worship. And again, this is nothing is like happening yet. The plot of the story of this vision has not started yet. It'll start next week when we get into chapter 5. For now, John is just sort of like being plopped into heaven, and he's looking around and going, oh my gosh. And we get the sense that like this is what's always happening in heaven, is the heavenly version of the people of God are always laying their power and authority down at the feet of God in worship. And then these guardian creatures are worshiping God even as they maintain the separation between heaven and earth, which is another key that's going to come in very important. So I don't have a ton in terms of thinking about how this relates to resisting authoritarianism this week, but because we're just building on this new vision cycle. But I do want to ask this, right? Who runs the world, and who has access to power? Right? Who are the people that guard power, that keep power? I think especially as we're looking at you just having passed this one big beautiful bill, we're looking at who does this sort of thing and who has power to do that thing. And it can seem like we are powerless. It can seem like we are helpless and hopeless, and it can seem like there's no point to any of this. But this is the beginning of John's reminder that what we see in front of us is not the truth of reality, that there's a lot more going on behind the curtain than we realize. And it's grounded in acknowledging that God is the one who is in charge, and that God's definition of power is that will ultimately win. Again, that's just a tease for what's coming in the next few weeks. Next week in particular, we're going to be talking about Jesus's appearance here, what that looks like. But for now, I just want to say thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found working through some of these symbols interesting. I hope it helped demystify the book a little bit and make it a little more accessible for you. So I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, or you can drop me an email or whatever. Again, this is free. This is to anyone who wants to tune in. You're welcome to subscribe either as a free or a paid subscriber if you'd like to help support. But yeah, please sound off. Let me know what you think of chapter 4 of Revelation. And we'll be back next week, same bat time, same bat channel. And we will be diving into what it looks like for us to, we're going to be meeting Jesus. So really excited for that. Until next week, grace and peace be with you.